So, welcome back in this last section of today, difficulties and potential of contemporary art in terms of peacemaking. Well, the title is already promising a lot. We are still wondering whether our colleague Dan Hicks is connecting from Oxford, but let me present first those who are here with me today. Elena Colombo has worked for 3 years for the Museo Egizio, and she's a museum study expert, I would say. Sara Sallam, who is one of our artists in residence for the bicentennial, and it's nice to have her here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I would like to add a personal note, please, which I know I share with Elena. As you know, we have two artists in residence. One is Sara Sallam and one is Ali Sherry, who has done, together with Sara, wonderful work with us. 2 weeks ago, when I went home after work, I was seeing on the news that was announced a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. And so I wrote him a message saying, well, Ali, I really hope that this is a dawn of a new beginning for your country. And he answered me immediately, my house has been hit by a missile and he lost both his parents. So please an applause for Ali, Sherry, and for the... We send him a huge hug, and it's kind of heavy, or talking about art as peacekeeping when you're dealing with real life out there. Maybe it's even more important to stress certain values in a museum. And Andrea Viliani, who is director of the Museum of Civilizations in Rome. We don't know, I'm looking at Federico, we don't know whether Dan Hicks will connect or not, but we start. If he will connect, he will join. Otherwise, you will have to deal only with us. But we're trying to do our best. We would like to try to develop a kind of discussions that I hope can be also provocative, and I hope can have also some reactions on the audience. I want to go back about something that we already mentioned yesterday concerning this museum. So how do we look at ancient Egypt from this place? Well, of course, we look at ancient Egypt from Turin. Of course, we look at ancient Egypt from Europe, and that is a given. Is it a guild? It's not a guild. I do not know. I think we have to come to terms with the past, also with the most recent past. Of course, we need transparency. Of course, we need to put things on the table. And we have to realize, it was very nice also in the presentation we just had with Alice, that there is no way that we can look at the past without the lens of the present. There is a huge literature at the end of 19th century, whether the past existed or not, or the past existing only used by the present. I quoted yesterday is one of my favorite book of Moses Finley, Use and Abuse of History, how history has been used and is used for us. No matter what agenda we have, we can use and manipulate history, and we have to be aware of that. Maybe, and we've been discussing this day, the future of museum is also on the ability of becoming more transparent, of the ability of putting objects on the table. But then have a first provocative, I hope, questions for you. Maybe I start asking this question directly with Andrea Viliani. You have to know that he's curating and directing one of the most problematic museum in the country. Is doing, in my knowledge, an amazing job. And I asked her, so he will explain much better than I do, but just to introduce you, you have to know that he's dealing with was first the Colonial Museum, the Museum of Italian Africa, which has been closed for a long time and reopened. And so one day we were at a talk together, and I said, Andrea, how can you decolonize your museum? And he said, it's simple. I will not, I cannot. How can you decolonize a colonial museum? But the thing is, you have to tell the story. You do not have to pretend something that you are not. And so the provocative question that I will answer first, ask first to Andrea and then to Sara is, are we here only scraping the surface? Are we doing certain things because it's wokeism, as Martin defined it yet, is kind of the fashion nowadays that to put at peace our soul, we have to deal with certain pieces. Are we really changing the narrative somehow, or we are scraping the surface? Andrea.
Well, thank you for the invitation. As Dan Hicks wrote and says in conferences like the one that he made at the Museum of Civilizations, whatever, in Roma, together with the General Director of Museums, Massimo Zanna, we need to understand that not just colonial museums, but the so-called ethnographic museums that we today prefer calling museums of war cultures, they were at some point weapons, exactly like bullets or the boots on the ground of the colonial empires that actually didn't acquire their collections, but they mostly, there are exceptions like the Museo Egizio, but mostly stole during war campaigns, for example in Africa, but not only, their collections. So what Hicks defined quite famously the Brutish Museum, which is the British Museum, is actually to be perceived as this kind of weapon, because culture, it's very important when you want to transform a narrative, because narrative is culture. And you need to convince your own citizens that, for example, it's good to have a colonial empire, because it's a lot of money, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of identification between the power in, for example, Britain or Germany or France or Belgium or Italy and other lands. So the Colonial Museum, for example, has been founded by Benito Mussolini in 1923. There are images, yeah, at some point. And it was a propaganda museum. Why? Because us, as Italian, we needed whatever, that's the, that's the Museum of Civilizations. We need to convince our own citizens that was worth going to Africa, and actually was worth going, as the museum tried to demonstrate at the time, that was not an invasion, but was going back home, because we went back to the former part of the Roman Empire. So we went back to Sabrata, we went back to Leptis Magna, we went back to Roman archaeology. And that's why, for example, Benito Mussolini, and that's why the people at the time wanted on purpose to have, now it's going to be messy because it's like one of the last images. Oops, not the last message. They wanted to have this culture, which you can see in the installation of this presentation of a small part of the former, the collection of the former colonial museum. This culture was the Venere di Cirene, the siren, Venus, Cyrene Venus, and it's not the original. The original was somewhere else, so has been commissioned a replica. And this replica, in a way, at the very entrance of the museum, demonstrated that we are going back to a place where we already were. So as Christian says, when somebody, in a way provocatively, is asking me, are you decolonizing the colonial museum? I say, no. No, of course not, because it would be like the Uffizi in Florence trying to de-renaissance the Uffizi Museum. This story is a colonial story. What we are trying to do is to transform history in stories, to open up what was a propaganda museum with the Venere di Cirene at the beginning in a intersectional, plural, open, dynamic, educativo place. Also because I don't know if you have kids, I don't have kids, but I know that the kids of my friends, they go to school and there is no lesson about the Italian history related to the colonial time. So in these cases, museums became schools or became the best allies with schools in order to tell this part of history and telling how we think it could be more productive today to tell this history, multiplying its stories. Of course, in the colonial museum there were not all the voices. It was a propaganda museum, so there are mostly Italian voices, and it was mostly made for Italian people. But today we can, for example, through contemporary art, through contemporary culture, through contemporary narratives, opening up the museology of these museums, asking people like Peter Friedel, who is not from Africa, but is from Austria, but he was one of the very first artists who started developing an interest in this ghostly history of Italian colonialism, not taught so much in schools, even until the last decade, I think, in universities. And this is a model of an unrealized office building in Tripoli, and you cannot see because it's transparent on top of this maquette, but it's a Fiat building in Tripoli. So what colonialism is not just occupying another country, is to develop an infrastructure for allowing this land to become productive. And we are in Turin, and also Fiat was part of all this mechanism. This is quite enlightening, or for me was enlightening, to understand that colonialism is also an economic enterprise, a cultural enterprise, and not just a military enterprise. And to have Fiat as part of this, I think it opened up the discourse about what we are as Italians and what our country is, and that's what the museum is trying to do now. But, and I try to be very short, but this is the focus of my reply. We need, this is very, very problematic what I'm going to say. We need, first of all, we open at 8 in the morning because we are a didactic museum, so 8 in the morning. Before 8, when we open up the doors, we need to think about exactly as they did in 1923, which audience, before thinking about the narrative, which audience is my audience? Because I don't think that there is an audience yet for this discourse. I quoted, I parlato di scuole. Okay, we need to convince, for example, the professori in the schools that it's worth to organize a visit to the museum. And so that's why we meet before the professori to present this story, because otherwise we don't have an audience. And if you talk to your friends or to yourself, are you interested in going to Eur Roma and visiting a colonial collection, when in Roma you can visit Galleria Borghese, go to the beautiful archaeological sites, etc. So first of all, we need to do exactly the same. We wanted a museum for propaganda purpose. We want a museum for another kind, let's say, that propaganda. So we need to build an audience before build the narrative of the museum, which is something that I discovered when I started thinking that nobody knew that there was a colonial collection or a colonial museum, apart from the scholars or some communities. But what about the audience at large? So this is quite frightening and discomforting at the beginning, but if you work on it, it's challenging in the middle and possibly rewarding at the end to have an audience for this collection. And that's why we wanted to open up the discourse in order to not present the past, but to tell the past in relationship to the relevance of the past today. And I'm happy to say that I wrote many times that as a country, our government has a plan, is developing a plan called Piano Mattei for Africa. So I think that as the Ethnographic Museum, Colonial Museum were tools at the time for certain purposes, we can be a tool for different purposes. If we wanted to develop a relationship with African countries, starting with the former Italian colonies, we are quite useful in a way. And that's why we started inviting artists, writers, chefs, poets, or just members of these communities to the museum to show these collections. And there are like beautiful surprises. First thing, artists told me, all the artists, not just for the former colonial museum, we have like prehistoric collections, African, American, Asian, Oceanian collections, early Middle Age collections, geopaleontology and lithomineralogy collections, folk and popular art collections. It's 2 million of objects. And it's a very encyclopedic museum about the histories of humankind in dialogue with them and with other species since the early phases of the world to today. To go back to the colonial museum. The artist told me, we don't want to be just artists in these museums. You are not a contemporary art museum. We want to be citizens, researchers, activists, and mostly members of our communities. We wanted to speak about the stories of my grandmother, my grandfather, or my nephew. For example, Ijaba Shego, I always thank Ijaba Shego, a novelist. She wrote a beautiful novel titled Cassandra in Mogadishu, Cassandra Mogadishu, Bompiani. Buy and read, it's beautiful. And there is a chapter in the middle titled Intermezzo decoloniale, and it's about visiting the Museum of Civilizations together with their family. And there are members of the family coming from Somalia that they remember the colonial times, but there are members of the family, like the nephews, that don't remember at all because they born in Italy about things from the past. And Ijaba is making researches and is making educational restitutions, which is what these artists ask. We don't do artworks, we do things that could be artworks or novels or something else out of a long-term founded institution through educational activities at the end. That's, I think, what Ijaba and all the other artists, okay, that's the mercheology, colonial mercheology, many maquettes because we were building an empire, so we needed architects as well. Oh, that's a beautiful project that I will hand with this. This is a beautiful Gnosis by Sami Balogi, which is inspired by the planispheri of the Renaissance collections like the Medici collection, but is without boundaries and black because it's the African Gnosis. Like, what about a word which is not already told but can be retold from this kind of perspective? But I would like to go to this. Uffa. Okay, that's it. And after ho finito. So the artists would like not just to do artworks, and they would like to do research. And the research starts from the collection, a collection which is very problematic, also because it's not so known. In 1956, we restituted as Italy to Ethiopia many things that there was coming during the colonial time from Ethiopia to Italy. We didn't find two paintings among the ones that we found and restituted coming from the parliament of Addis Ababa. Two paintings were missing. They are here. They were lost in translation, missed in some passage. And we decided to restore these two paintings when we found, and we shared the paintings with the audience. And of course, museums don't restitute. They prepare the papers, and we work with Christian as part of a group of institutions, and Christian was the president of this working group. And we realized quite soon that our colleagues don't understand why we contact a museum which is not a colonial museum, asking, maybe you have some colonial things. Can you tell us? I said, no, I don't have colonial things. Okay, we discovered that almost every museum in Italy has colonial things, including the Royal Palace in Naples, where we discovered there was the throne of the Negus in the middle of the Bourbon thrones. Because when, there is also a dispersion of this story. Try to not forget in a way about. And that's the not forgetting.
And that one was forgotten altogether, because that one was not even, sorry if I interrupt you, but it was, since this is our other working group, it was quite interesting because this throne came supposed to stay in Naples for 6 months, because in Italy every 2 years was organized this Mostra di Oltremare, so the objects were coming from the colonies, but then the war broke out, and so the throne was there, but with no paper whatsoever. Then the Allies came, and half of the collection got dispersed, and after the end of the war, it ended up in the National Palace, with all the difficulties, because the National Palace had to become a museum, which is, well, another discourse altogether in this country about what happened with national palaces. And then this throne is there with no paper, so it was not even asked back for the restitution, because it's not one of the official objects looted, but now is high up also in the ministry. But it was interesting what Andrea said, because when we started writing to our colleagues, to all the 450 national museums in Italy, would you please check on provenance and double check if you have unprovenance objects? The reaction was mostly, how dare you? I'm the Uffizi, I'm the National Archaeological Museum. And then it turned out at every single museums. And most of the solution was, we keep it on the store, we don't talk about it. And so nobody knows that we have that. And it was quite interesting, a needed process to go through.
I think it was a process that historically will be very relevant at some point. You say something about the provenance, so I would like to say thank you to the funzionarie, Gaia Del Pino, Rosanna Di Lella, who before my appointment already started this very humble and secret thing that the artists ask us to do research. First of all, the museum need to do research. And we both, the beautiful thing about contemporary art in this museum is always like that, but is essential that the museum and the artist don't ignore themselves, but work closely one to the other. So I'm really grateful to these employees, to these funzionari, to these curatrici, because they conducted an everyday research about provenances. And that's also important. Why? Because we didn't know that we didn't restitute these two paintings, so we need research in order to understand which paintings these paintings are. And when is like a document, like a photograph, say, okay, this restituted. What about this? Sometimes it's a little bit blurred document. Oh, my God, this is the painting that we in the story. So that's like an epiphany, which is the base of what we are doing together with the artist. And sometimes we work with the artists for years, in particular with 6 artists that we decided to invite as research fellows, like artists in residence. And it's Maria Teresa Alves for the Americas, Caribbean Film Collective for Pacific Islands and Oceania, Sami Balogi that you saw for Africa, Galapora scheme that we shared with the Museo d'Arte Orientale in Turin as a project for Asia, DAR for the building, because the building is an international universal exhibition of Rome, Euro, so there is a loaded story about that, and Bruno Esposito for the folk and popular. But sometimes we just invite artists to share a little bit less with us, but which is essential. For example, the first artist that we invited buying an artwork was Ali Cherry, related to the prehistory, digging up, and now the ground is always important in terms of which kind of national and individual culture you want to share with the others. But to go back to this painting, you see these beautiful paintings, and we didn't commission, we bought this video to an artist. His name is Teo Escetu. It was the last edition available. We bought it through the PAC, which is a specific bundle, tender that Italian government grant to every kind of institution who is interested in articulating the role of contemporary art, including historical museums. And Teo Escetu tell in this video, which is now part of the collection of the former Colonial Museum, tell the history of a restitution already happened. Not these 2 paintings, which is in the process. We are preparing the papers. At some point, somebody will decide if we want and we are allowed as a nation to restitute to Ethiopia. I think so. But this is about the restitution, one of the most monumental restitution that already happened, which is the obelisco di Axum, the Axum obelisk that has been restituted already by Italy to Ethiopia. And what is beautiful is that this video tells the story, the before and the after of this story, and it does using the same style, sort of a comic stripes styles of traditional Ethiopic paintings that are in the collection. So you can understand better this kind of structure of this Ethiopic traditional painting if you look at this at another narrative, which is not about Sheba or whatever, or the Negus, but about a restitution. So that's the link, formal, aesthetical, culture that we are trying to develop in this collection. Every artwork, it's useful to understand the history of the collection and vice versa. So there is no improvisation and there are no good intentions. One artist told me, please erase this idea that being a colonial museum, you need to have good intentions because you need to be pragmatic. You need to do research, you need to educate people, no good intentions, no morale. That's why we don't decolonize like kind of ethic. We tell stories and as is art through artworks. But considering the last so long, I'm sorry. Okay, we go to, I think that's the end. Okay, we talked about the beginning of the museum. Now we are dealing with this. What happened in the middle between the Museum of Civilizations and 1923? Something with artists told me, writers, artists, our funzionari, this group, working group told me, you know, there is another date which is very, very, very important. It's not 1923, it's not now, it's 1971. And being direct, I'm totally ignorant because I deal with unions and with that's okay. And say, why? Because we closed the former Colonial Museum in 1971. So there are 2 things that are important in relation to museum. When you open it and we decide to close and disperse it. Because we don't have all the Colonial Museum. We add what has not been perceived at the time as useful somewhere else. For example, the big paintings about the colonial wars, Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Moderna e Contemporanea, the animals, stuffed animals, animali imbalsamati, Ecoparco di Roma. So there are precise, interesting strategies about forgetting, dispersing, erasing, and creating oblivion, which is a solution for a former colonial museum. You don't decolonize, you just disperse, you don't tell the story, you just disperse and forget about, which is a sort of a maquillage, and it teaches us that we need to understand provenances, not just from Ethiopia or Somalia, but where are now these things, or why they have been erased from a public discourse. And that's why we need to build an audience and to do research and to mediate the research to this audience. Because at the end of the day, it's a sort of a detection. It has a political value, civic value, cultural value, so it's much more than reopening the colonial museum. I pray to not be the director that from a former colonial museum reopen a new colonial museum. But at the end, I know that is not happening if I do something that is useful for contemporary people, not just Afro-descendenti, but people from Eura, from Roma, from the center of my neighborhood, who has this kind of story all around. And that's what we are doing, for example, through this project that now is closed because of the anti-incendio. So we are working on the second chapter, title, that's the end. Oh, this is what. Title, Museum of Opacities, and the title comes from this poet, Edouard Glissant. He went in 1959 to Rome for the Congresso Mondiale degli Scrittori e degli Artisti Neri, March 1959, and he writes many things as a poet, including the fact that every woman and every man has the right to be opaque, to not be transparent, so that transparency sometimes is dangerous, to not be only one thing, or, the thing that is so evident that is transparent, because we are mixed. There are like various layers, and that's the museum that we are trying to reopen, an opaque museum, which is not negative, is this intersectionality, plurality, multiplicity, makes us opaque. And being opaque means also that the oblivion about the colonial past is part of the history of the museum. We want to tell that it was 50 years from 1971 to Gaia Del Pino and Rosanna Del studying these papers and these works that we thought we were not a colonial country, we don't have nothing, etc. It was there. And in this time, okay, that's a beautiful, beautiful installation that we commissioned to a group of artists in residency, led by Visalu Babi, and it's titled Phono Museum of Rome. So it's an hypothetical museum inside of the real museum. And it imagines something that also Jabashego told me. The vitrines are almost empty, but there are things. So this museum is in progress, and what is beautiful is that partially is the works from the storerooms, from the storage of the former colonial museum, and many things are from the houses of people, because there are colonial items everywhere. So it's in our everyday life, it's not just in museums. And sometimes this thing is also so relevant that, no finito, that truly, this time truly, that we can say something like that. Ijaba Shego told me, there was a tradition in Somalia. Women had like a spatula, brush, had a brush for doing that on the hair of their daughters. And this is a typical thing that happens also in Italy, to tell stories from the mother to the sister, talk about the grandmother, the ancestor, etc. And the daughters stay calm because there is the brush. You know that there is no anymore this tradition in Somalia because there are no anymore these brushes or this way of transmitting traditions. But you know what, Andrea? And that's the end. You have many of these brushes in your storeroom. Keep telling the stories. inviting mothers, inviting daughters, reenact a tradition which is lost. That's the potentiality of the museum when it's considered linked to the contemporaneity of its collections and its mission.
Thank you. Can I add a question for you? We are struggling ourselves because it seems a little, a big work to do for an artist, this one. So do we delegate only on contemporary artists, the conflict, the complexity, the extractive tendencies of diasporic collection in a museum, and above all, should the artists themselves have a diasporic background, or can we even at some point legitimate, if possible, the voices of white scholars and artists? And yet, do we in this way so legitimate only diasporic voices? Do we perpetuate the opposition or not? And how do we translate the past into words and into new images like yours, beautiful one, and move behind it? A lot of things, I know.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I would like to start with something you mentioned about the museum being an opaque place, and this idea of transparency, and it's a kind of a different way of looking at what does transparency mean, and here proposing that an opaque space, one that embraces shadows and the unknown and the layers, and because of the multiplicity of these layers, we acknowledge that we cannot see everything, and that's okay. So I want to start with this as like a larger idea about knowledge and the seeking of knowledge as a way of seeing and clarity, and this exposing of the past in order to learn about the past. And when we talk about ancient Egypt, this exposure, this shedding light, is often really exposure and shedding layers of, oftentimes, of unwrapping and revealing things that were not supposed to be revealed in the name of knowledge seeking and this transparency, this light. In a way, artists like myself getting invited to respond to these problematics that live in museum archives and collections, whether these collections are of a colonial nature or they were accumulated due to the colonial infrastructure of the time. So despite that colonial or resulting from colonialism, it's a big responsibility to place it on artists that get parachuted into the institution, and they are now in need to learn about the past and the history and the stories of that institution in order to find their position of where can they poke around and which gaps can they try to imagine ways of filling. So it's a lot of responsibility to place it on someone from outside of the institution. That makes me think of two things. You asked in your questions whether artists need to be of a diasporic background, and what can we do with white Western perspectives. I think it is easier for a museum with a diasporic collection to invite an artist of a diasporic background as a way of the artifacts left and traveled and have this displacement journey, and that creates automatically a connection with an artist who also left and traveled and migrated and is reconnecting with their past through the encounter with the similarly diasporic collection. It is easier to create this narrative of nostalgia. And I am a product of that. I am an artist who immigrated, who is working a lot with museums who have diasporic collections. And my work really relies on my personal experience and how I also left Egypt and searched for it outside of Egypt. But in a way, to ask the question whether we should be relying on diasporic artists, if we call it like that, versus legitimizing or finding ways to legitimize, again, white male often perspectives, I would say two things to that. One, museums have always been places where white Western male voices were dominant.
Thank you. You added male. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So these voices have always been heard in museums, and you also started by saying museums were weapons shaping a narrative and deciding what stories to be told, convincing everyone in the community of that museum of why these institutions were built, and the pride of empires and collecting and retracing the heritage of one place to another ancient place. So it is not where I hope museums go from moving, like right now, recently, inviting artists with diasporic communities. I wouldn't want to see that shift to thinking how to legitimize, again, white male voices, but actually to move one step ahead and think of the communities of origin. The artwork is, like you said, is not necessarily the goal of this collaboration, of this invitation. And I think oftentimes it is. If I'm invited by a museum and that commission results in an artwork, that artwork stays with the diasporic collection. And it becomes part of these objects that are maybe nostalgic of home, while involving communities of origin and bringing these voices from home in contact with the artifacts, in contact with their displaced heritage. I think that should be the next step, to really suture that rupture that is caused by the displacement between the places of origin of these objects and the communities that are still there, whether they are direct communities or communities of descendants. Just the fact that they are linked by locality, by land, there are already a lot of shared experiences to explore. I hope that somehow answers your question.
Thank you.
May I add something to that? I would like to ask you a bit if you would like to, on one hand, to explain to us why you have chosen to, as a topic of your reflection here in the museum for the bicentennial, about segments, how you have come to that and what you want to say with the work of art, which is part of our display at the moment. Why have you come to that? Since the input that I had given you when we started getting to know each other was more, could you help us to reflect on what is a museum? Is a place of destruction, is a place of construction? But in the meantime, I would like also you to go back, if you want, to the fact, is it a shortcut for museums to say, actually we do exactly what we've done, but when we have invited an artist because it's fashion at the time, I'm being provocative, of course, and so, well, we have done what we are supposed to do, check it, and then the rest we keep business as usual. Is that what, don't we run the risk on doing that a little bit?
Let's start with that, then talk about my response through the artwork that I worked on here. Can it be used as a check, you know, as an agenda? Yes, of course it can be, and it's an easy one. And it's this decolonial, nice sounding word, decolonizing our practices or diversifying the voices in the museum by inviting new perspectives, alternative perspectives. These are all trending approaches that a lot of museums are considering and engaging with, and it can be a shortcut. It is possible. I think what is more interesting is to really benefit from that exchange and to make use of it. Again, connecting to something you said, it's not about that short-term meeting. It should be the process and the consequences of that exchange and building on top of that, and not just in the realm of contemporary art making, but thinking about archaeological practices. The museum is not detached, especially here, is not detached from archaeological in the field, on the ground, in Egypt work. Curators are archaeologists, are scholars who are shaping and interpreting the past, dealing directly with objects. So in this exchange and the collaboration with the artist ideally should be fruitful beyond the making of an artwork to just bring new audiences into the galleries. I hope that this is part of the long term. If there is an agenda, I hope that this is part of it. Even if that becomes trending, the hope is that somehow some real change happens beyond the making of another object to be displayed in the museum. Okay, so when I arrived here and as an artist in residence, the prompt or the hope that we would collaborate together to respond to also the bicentenary and rethinking that statuario. And it was also a time where the museum was engaging with a lot of research on how to recontextualize these statues in the galleries. And I think my initial goal was, from the beginning, before even deciding to work with and about the Sekhmet statues, I wanted to focus on the foundational, the core of the collection. Why are these objects here? How did they end up here? And I think, again, museums as places that shape stories, I think this is really powerful. Not just the stories of the objects, but the stories of the institution that brought these objects together is really key to also understanding the objects. And you mentioned in the beginning how we use history and can shape it and reshape it. And I wanted to focus on how history shapes us, how where we came from affects how we are now looking at the collection. And one of the things that really stood out to me here was the gallery where the museum tells its own history downstairs. And one painting stood out, a painting by Faubin that shows Trovetti measuring a colossal statue of a head, surrounded by his field men in the area of Karnak, and in the presence of other Egyptian locals. And this was for me the starting point of looking at the different hierarchies that exist in this painting. The painting had the scientific act of measuring the statue, that using the measuring, I don't know, what is it called, some measuring tool to measure, study, to learn about that object with the group of people that somehow all of them had connections with Napoleon, whether a painter of a wife and like they all had connections to the military invasion, even though Drovetti himself had the legal paperwork to excavate, and the term excavating implies a scientific process, but it wasn't a scientific process at that time. You have this group of parachuted foreigners studying the object, having access to the land, having access to the people to work for them, to excavate and scar the land and take what they find, as though whatever is found was waiting to be discovered, to be found and removed. So this was the trigger for wanting to focus on Drovetti's collection. And of course, it has a large number of a specific type of statues, the Sekhmet statues. The Sekhmet statues that the museum here holds are about 21, or 21 and a small piece, right? So almost 22 statues of a lot more scattered around the world, all coming from Egyptian temples that their diaspora resulted from legally conducted extractions of the land. So I wanted to connect that history with what the original function of these statues were. What was it for the maker of these statues, and trying to think again beyond the scientific knowledge, beyond the archaeological significance of these objects, but also to look at the shadows, to look at the opacities, to look at their spiritual nature, to look at what the ancient Egyptian belief systems, how they were structured, what did they hope to achieve with that many, more than 700 statues of the same kind, all dedicated to one king for his protection in his life and his afterlife. And connecting that history of extraction with what happened later in the early 1920s of the discovery of that tomb where the king was buried. It's kind of a story about how archaeology has a consequence on the past also, not just on our current, present, or the future, also how we relate to our ancestors, but also how it affected the ancient king. If you do not believe in ancient Egyptian mythology, you can still relate to the opening of a tomb and the desecration of someone's resting place in the name of seeing, in the name of knowing, in the name of possessing, and also the consequence of presenting the body of the king in a museum brings us again to that experience of encountering his statues in museums. So the artwork that I was putting together touches on a multiple research findings that only resulted through the collaboration with the museum team opening up their archives. But at the end of the day, I'm a parachuted artist. I don't have the knowledge that someone who's embedded inside of the institution can change. I will always create alternative perspectives, but I think reshaping
You
the
seem
institutional
an expert now, you know? Yeah.
Yes, I think I didn't study archaeology or didn't really learn much about ancient Egypt in my upbringing in Cairo. But I think I'm also trying to learn about my heritage from like wearing a lens beyond the archaeological lens, and it's very difficult. It is a dominant lens.
Yeah. It's true. We have a little bit of time, so I'm trying to make you two questions together for you both. The first one, you already touched the issues, but it's this question. In a legally acquired collection like us, legally, are we in accordance to the law at that time? Are we safe from fierce contestation or not? And the last one, that in these difficult times is very heavy. How can a shared reciprocal narrative can initiate when we have to relate with a country which is not properly democratic? I think now we have so many situations, very difficult, very painful, but it is an issue because you have to face someone who could be an interlocutor.
Somebody to be in dialogue with.
Yeah. Is it a problem or not? So there are two questions, two different questions.
May I have the last image? Beep, beep, beep. Whatever. Oh, sorry.
Been struggling for 3 days, but let me try.
Thank you. So once I thank you for the question, because this is actually one of the questions with capital Q. I was speaking to Maria Teresa Alves. She's working with all our funzionari and funzionari at the museum, but as well, she told us something very meaningful at the beginning. I cannot represent Americas. I cannot even represent all the worst good-intentioned tool like the artist in residence for a long-term, generously funded research is not an ideal instrument. In particular, if you want to re-hang and rewrite the labels of an entire collection dedicated to Americas. And at some point, she also told us, I tell you the story of a restitution I was part of as an activist, as a member of the community. Oh, there isn't, I'm sorry, it's my mistake. But there was a beautiful image, let's use another one. I don't know. These are the little maybe. There was an image of Maria Teresa placing stickers. It was like the most beautiful project that we did, I think, until now in the World Cultural so-called collections, and it costed 200 euros. Stickers with a QR code and a text and unwritten by Maria Teresa, I don't agree. And she put those stickers on everything she didn't agree with in the museum, and it was supposedly 500 stickers. So a lot. The first sticker was on the banner, even before getting in the collection, saying collezione di arti e culture americane. It was close to americane. Americane? So if you want to start thinking about this collection, you should also think that calling Americane from Amerigo Vespucci is not a good start, at least from various points of view of the indigenous natives community that don't label themselves America. I know that is shocking to you, but no. So I don't agree. And at the end, she told us, which is not part of the project, but is written, I think, in the text, and I would like to thank our curator and consultant, Matteo Lucchetti, who oversaw this project in detail. At the end, maybe in the text, maybe not, I don't remember this, she tells the story of this restitution, saying that, you know, that at some point from the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, they wanted to restitute some fabric to the indigenous community. And good intention. Maybe not the Berlin bronzes, but yes, for this fabric. Okay, and they went, they started the papers, and actually they were shocked to know that the community was not able to receive back. You say, what? Because for the community, it was not an act of stealing an object, was actually an acting of a subject abandoning the community. So the object was a subject and it was not stolen, but was a traitor. You cannot give back something which is somebody that actually betrayed the community. They don't know your version, they know their version. So as the act of appropriation, looting, stealing is unilateral, the act of restitution should be at least bilateral. That's the beginning, as this is something that Dan Hicks told us in the museum. The restitution is not the end, it's another beginning, or maybe it's a new and the very first beginning, because you understand much better the culture that you actually appropriated without understanding so much of this culture. So in terms of, there is not just not good interlocutory, sometimes it's actually that you don't know who the interlocutor is, even when he's a so-called democratic from the Western point of view. And that's my end. I announce very hands and and another artist. So that's why artists are important, because as you say, they are parachuted sometimes, but when they start feel confident, we are parachuted in our own collection. In a way, say, what? Okay, we understand now. In a way, of course, the funzionary knows, etc. But the most important thing to me is the audience. So what is shared at the end to the real owner of the museum, which is the audience. And Maria Teresa told us, together with another artist, I don't want to face the commitment that you wanted that I should face, to rehang with you the collection. Because for two things. I don't think that you don't have my audience in Roma. You have your audience. I cannot install the collection for an audience that is somewhere else. So you should risk losing your audience. And it's bad for you and for me, because an audience is somebody to talk to. And I want to talk to them as well. So install your collection as you install this collection. Give me some room, and we are now 30 people, not just Maria Teresa Alves, to do a sort of a dialogue into the rehanging. So you do that, and I have like square meters to do. I don't agree. But what is important for me is that both things are important, because you are a Western museum, you cannot decolonize the colonial history, but as well, I think that you didn't understand exactly what is in your vitrine. And so it's like balance at the end. This is working on now for the American collection. And I thank Loretta Paderni, and I thank Camilla Fratini, and I thank Francesca Manuela Anselmo, because they're keeping alive this dialogue with 30 people that don't agree with us, which is fantastic, because at the end we are actually working together. this is the analog of the restitution. So it's actually, we know that we don't understand yet each other. The other thing, and it's at the end, the third time that I say the end is the end, that Gala Poraskin for the Asian collections, she made a beautiful thing, and she will do something different here in Mao, in Turin, with my friend Davide Quadrio. She actually told us at the very beginning, so it's shocking. So we are parachuted really in our own collection from this kind of point of view. You know, guys, you have 2 millions of objects. Like, you are proud of these 2 millions of objects that we have. And you know what, guys, that I think, not sure, because I starting now my research 2 years long, but I think that at the end of these 2 years, I will tell you the same thing that I'm telling you the first day. Not even one of these objects on 2 millions has been conceived by their original makers for being shown in a vitrine. And there are vitrines everywhere here. So you are actually showing these pieces in a very inappropriate way if you want to share the original cultures. So that's okay, yeah? You cannot destroy your vitrines and put these things on temples, grass, etc. But can we tell the story of how fictional is this way of? So this kind of idea is that, okay, we cannot renounce to what we are, and we cannot ask the artist to make us more real and more proper that we are, but in a sort of a multiverse or like a hypothetical way, there are more than in institutions. Exactly. That's it.
I think I want to start with, I already briefly hinted at that, that idea of a legally collected or a legally acquired collection, and whether that saves it from contestations, from the discussion of restitution, or even contextualizing it in a different discourse, in a even without the attempts of decolonizing, but just to acknowledge the colonial nature of it, even though it was legally acquired. I think it is very difficult to just have a blind eye to the historical context that resulted in these laws that allowed for these objects to live as gifts or donations or purchases. I think the economical situation, the power imbalance is not something to dismiss. Because it is a colonial infrastructure that allowed for these laws to be written the way that they were, and most of these diplomatic relations were exchanges of favors. I protect you and I get to do this and this and that. So the fact that diplomats or general consuls were allowed to have a side job of collecting antiquities next to giving advice, diplomatic advice, for their own selves, to sell these objects to other to the governments of the Western world of their pleasing, is not, and I think is not just like, this is a collection that is legally acquired, it's all fine, we don't need to talk about colonialism. No, it is really a colonial infrastructure that allowed for this extraction. And to begin by acknowledging that is one step towards seeing the wounds and seeing the violence, and that is a prerequisite before healing anything. And the wounds are not necessarily, which is something also that I find often spoken about, the wounds are not just in the colonized, formerly colonized countries or the exploited countries. The wounds are also in the descendants of the colonizing countries. To have that as part of your heritage, of your past.
we are not still able to think about the fascist era and about the relationship with Nazi and about what happens to our heritage. So we have to go on. It's a long way.
Yeah, it's a lot of unlearning and trying to face one's, looking in the mirror. And I think this is part of the retelling of history that is needed, not just for those who are exploited, but also for, I think this should be the motivation why museums are trying to rethink their practices. First and foremost, I think to do something about all the wounds that the past have inflicted on so many people. And as an Egyptian myself, I cannot, I've been talking mostly as an artist, but I'm an Egyptian who grew up in Cairo, and it is difficult to be in a symposium seeing scholars talking about pre-dynastic skeletal remains of my ancestors and not respond to that emotionally. And to hear that it is heritage that belongs to the world, I agree that the knowledge belongs to the world, but the heritage came from a specific location, came from a specific area, and it is displaced. And to acknowledge the displacement is really important to not cause new wounds for the nephews that don't have the past when they learn about it.
Not even knowing that they don't have the past.
Yeah, exactly. So I think recognizing the erasure, the omission of the history, acknowledging it is a step for a lot of healing, not just for others, but also for those caring for the collections. Thank you.
I want to come back to this point, and now I'm trying to be very provocative as well. First, for the last thing you said, I think that somehow maybe Egypt and Italy have a shared past. We are one of the source country, like is Greece, and I've never shared that kind of sense of being deprived of my cultural heritage when I go to the Nelson Atkins Museum in America, in the Midwest, and I see that one of the most visited galleries is Italian art. I feel so proud. I feel, wow, this is much better than every embassy that we could have. When I see people queuing up to go to the Mona Lisa in the Louvre and to say that an Italian painting legally given by the artist to the king, so there is nothing about, so it should be there to be clear, but I feel very proud. I mean, there is also a kind of another story, because are we not going into a kind of fashion that now is fashion to say, because reading, for instance, very carefully the book of Dan Hicks, I think there is a kind distinction, a very big distinction, when you talk about Benin in former Nigeria, and you come up with a percentage, 90% of the cultural heritage is not there anymore, whether you have a problem. We wouldn't be able to say that Italian cultural heritage is not here, is here and dispersed, and Egyptian cultural heritage is mainly in Egypt, thanks God, and dispersed, but it's not that in Egypt we don't have cultural heritage. So I'm asking you another question, also taking into account what Andrea was saying. We are, as museum, we want to be inclusive. We want to talk to an audience. We work for and foremost also for the society where we function. And then, looking at the newspapers, looking where the world is going at this moment, looking what is the percentage of people coming to a museum, and in this country is said that 26% of the Italian population go to a museum once a year. The majority out there really we're not dealing with, I'm being provocative, but I want to be. The majority out there doesn't deal with LGBTQ rights. They don't deal with globalization. They fight globalization. The word identity is coming back in the discourse more and more. The word nation and nationalism. I don't say that the museum should hug this kind of thing, but don't we run the risk? Also made me think what Friederike said yesterday, that sometimes the visitors go to the Humboldt Forum when they come to the Neues Museum and they feel home when they come to the Neues Museum, to a more, let's say, traditional way of thinking. Don't we run the risk that we are isolating ourselves in an island where we have a very intellectual discourse, where the people out there apparently more and more do not understand us? And so are we not failing at the very heart of what it would be? Probably we are failing in engaging in a dialogue. Well, of course, if we had the answer, we would be, we would be win the Nobel Prize for peace, probably. So I'm not asking you the answer, but shouldn't we consider also in the agenda, in the cultural agenda in our museums, if we want to remain relevant, to be in dialogue with, and I always give this example because it's very, very easy to use adjective that can be very offensive, that you tell to a person, you are a racist, or you are, I don't know, nationalistic, whatever. And then you come to stories we are talking about, and then you discover that there is a lady who bought her apartment in a certain part of town, and she bought a pretty amount of money. And then things have changed, and all in a sudden, she is the only original native in that area, surrounded by foreigners, speak other languages. She becomes a foreigner within her country, and then she starts being afraid. And so she becomes critical or not accepting other people just because the situation have changed. So what I'm saying, are we not running the risks here to, if our panel was saying that we want to bring peace, how can we bring peace to society? How can we be in dialogue with the vast majority of those people, 74%, who do not come to our museum, who have other values? How can we not adjust, but find a way to be in real dialogue? Otherwise, it becomes, Maria Luisa was saying, she said 2 times in the past few days, we are more and more irrelevant as a number. If you count the humanists, even within the academic numbers of professors, we are the little minority. How can the museum avoid to become irrelevant? I don't know who wants to start. It's not that easy now.
Okay, it is not an easy question.
If you have the solution, I'll hire you immediately, by the way.
No, but I think you just said my suggestion. I think it really, first and like the first thing that came to my mind is the definition of the museum. What is a museum? The relevance of the museum is directly linked to what is the purpose of that museum. To stay relevant needs to be part of what the museum wants to achieve. And that brings me to, you just said hiring, you know. I think this is about who constitutes the museum. If the museum has the percentage of employees are male, heterosexual, Western, if this is the main dominant group that leads the museum from within, decides, yeah, then of course it is a singularity, even if the purpose is to stay relevant with contemporary things. It's still about the eyes and the senses of that creature that is composed of multiple people. So the multiplicity should not just be by inviting people, but it should be from the core of the museum. I think also bringing these topics, it should not be something that is like a secondary mission of the museum to feel the pulse of the public and see how we can respond to that, but it should be really, like you said multiple times, it's all about knowing who is the audience that we're talking to, who is the public, and sometimes the public is not necessarily those who you want to reach, right? So I think that's maybe a very vague answer, but I wanted to jump one step back to something you mentioned, and the fact that you said that there is a pride in seeing one's collection from home displayed in another country. And of course, there is that sense also that it gives those who are living abroad a sense of a new home. So it does fulfill, it has a positive aspect to it, to the communities who are far from home. But the fact that in Egypt there are still so much artifacts and material culture, it's not the amount that is left is not because it wasn't taken. What I mean is it's not due to, yeah, it's not like they didn't try. It's more that there is abundance of it, that it's it's the result of long ancient civilizations, of like a long period of time that resulted in this heritage, and not that not all of it was taken. If they could, they would. That's what I was trying to say. So it is very different to see material culture in a museum outside of home, when it is legally given or gifted versus that it's looted or from a war, or also from a colonial infrastructure. So I just wanted to accentuate that there is a difference between the different examples that you gave.
Well, just to be clear, yes, to a certain point, in the sense what has happened after the unification of this country and what happens after that. Of course, we shouldn't forget the past of this country. This country was also occupied by Austria, was occupied by France, and a lot of objects went out. There are people in this country asking for restitution. I'm not among them at all. I think that everything which has gone away. So it's not because we shouldn't compare talking about at least the first half of the 19th century what this country was compared to was continental Europe. We were not even unified and we were occupied ourselves. So part of the heritage has gone out in that period.
So we share pain.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't share
Some
pain.
sort?
I share pride. Let's put it this way. Andrea.
But I think that the Egyptians should be less scared about the disappearance of the audience than the Museum of Civilizations, for example, considering how successful is the Museo Egizio, and is, I consider, a model for all the other directors in Italy, of course, including other few museums and few places, because if you count, people tend to like the same. And this same change, okay, but it's... And this is something that I think it could be just getting worse, not better, because of the digital. So we are facing the fact that you, at some point, if you want to be very, very realistic, there will be a moment when I don't go to Dresda to see the Gemalde Gallery for my New Year's Eve because I wanted to see the Madonna Sistina before then I'm dying, together with La Notte di Correggio and that Venere di Giorgione Tiziano. So I want to go there to see in time. But at some point there will be so fantastic Google art versions, and I can stay like that rather than walking in the cold of Dresden. So I think that we need to think about not just the now, where there are many people not getting in our physical institutions, physical bodies, but in the near future, it will be, I don't mean irrelevant, the number of physical visitors. I think it will become critical, the distinguishing what is better, to see from real or to have an immersive, augmented, accessible understanding, even more entertaining than what we can do with the three-dimensionality of these buildings with square meters and things like that. So having, for example, to look back at what Gala Poraskim says, having back all our Asian collections in a multiverse, back to the temples, on the grass, etc., I think that is what your question is much more frightening than we can think about in replying that maybe yes, maybe not, we can be more reserved. I think that the museums are, facing what we are facing as human beings, a revolution. It will be like a massive revolution, and that's why I'm so lucky to not be in the contemporary art field anymore, because I'm learning so much more from museums like this one or the museum, where I think contemporary cultures and contemporary risk and contemporary agenda, whatever is contemporary, even the water, are like much more challenging and revealing, because contemporary is also a modernist trap. I love the fact that the prehistory collection is considered, if we want to be sincere, with all the respect to the colonial collection, the most fucking contemporary collection that we have, because we can study, and I think there are like suspicious visitors that I think they are not visitors, but they are studying if they can understand something more about generative artificial intelligence from the difference between Neanderthal and Sapiens, because just moving a little bit of a bone has been expanded the brain and created something different. So I think that if, what I think that the museums are really great in self-defending themselves, because they are also working for the audiences from the past and the audiences from the future. And it's a little bit like Interstellar, what I'm saying, that there are things in museums, that's the good part of museums, that work for many people, including the people that are not living in the present. The works are the best ambassadors of these energies, and I think that, okay, take it easy. We are not so successful at Netflix. How many are you? Not as many as there are, like at home, looking at the House of the Hunting Hill, which is a beautiful series that I saw yesterday. But okay, we are not irrelevant because our works, because these stories, and we try to be more relevant, more accessible. That's your everyday job, Christian, and you are very good in that. It's my everyday job, and maybe I'm not so good in that, but we are trying our best to be more successful. But it's not just the present. I think that, technology, culture at large, the big things, we'll find a solution for our museums and for our collection. They resisted the world wars, etc. One thing that we should solve is what you say a couple of times, and we should totally agree. We think that our museums are accessible, or they are trying their best, because we think with our brain, and in general, our brain, I mean the sponsors, sometimes the director, but the sponsor, the presidents, the politicians, whatever, they think with their brain, and in general this brain is a white, straight, Western brain, and that's why we think museums are accessible, because we made the museum all around us, our body, so in the Museo Egizio, I was with your colleagues a few weeks ago at the Mauto. You are great because you are trying to opening up the accessible museum to other versions of accessibility, which is the predominante for augmenting, because we need to be more comfortable. We need to be more understandable. We need to have to satisfy other needs, not just the one that we already satisfy. So I think that accessibility, which is a big investment for the PNRR at the moment, it's an occasion that is small, in terms of the eternity of our collections and the future path. But we need to take advantage from what we have. And the idea for the Museum of Civilization is that to be more accessible is the only way that we can at least try to have a little bit more of visitors. And at the end of the day, Netflix series will be much more successful than the Museum of Civilization. And that's okay.
Yes, we have also to take to be okay if people do not come to the museum. So 0, now minus 0.3. So our time is over. Thank you for coming here, and thank you, Sara, for your wonderful work of art.